All right, welcome everyone. Stephen, if you will, give me a thumbs up to let me know you can hear me okay. Awesome, thank you. Welcome everybody to the Purdue Black Cultural Center's virtual learning lab. We are so happy to be with you today in this Zoom space. uh, we have been engaging in these virtual learning labs as a way to keep programming going, keep learning happening, and we are very excited for today's guest and facilitator, Stephen Lane II, who is a special collections librarian at the Indianapolis Public Library. He's going to be talking to us today about the drag queens of Indiana Avenue. I was fortunate enough to sit in on this presentation of this bountiful research maybe a little over a year ago, and I was just blown away. And so I'm so excited that he's able to share his research and findings and curiosities with us about this wonderful subject matter. Before we dive in too deep, I just want to let folks know that they can submit questions and answers or questions in the chat, and we will do a Q&A at the end of the presentation. And I'll also be sharing a link to a very quick survey that we would appreciate you filling out so that we can continue to excel and provide programming that suits you all, especially in this space that we're all in together. So a little brief intro. It says here in 1933, Indianapolis hosted its first Pansy Ball in the popular Black Entertainment District situated along Indiana Avenue. If you're not familiar with Indiana Avenue is one of Indianapolis's historically Black neighborhoods. It used to be the hub for uh, Black experience in Indianapolis and often in the Midwest. The pansy craze took off in Indianapolis as gay and trans Black people carved out a visible presence in the Black entertainment industry. And so I'm, with that little tidbit and that little trinket, that little teaser, I'm gonna turn it over to Stephen to share more as we dive into this information.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Denicia. That was great. It's perfect. And hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'll start sharing my screen with you so you can see my presentation here. And let's see if I can minimize that. Okay, there we go. So everyone see the screen okay? So you can see here that the title of the presentation is a little bit different. It says the female impersonators of Indiana Avenue. So I decided to go with that title because that was the language that was available to the performers, and that was the language they would have preferred to use at the time, as they saw drag queen was more of a derogatory term at that at that time. So, and female impersonator was actually seen as more of having a professionalism and a stage presence attached to that term. So we know that terms do change over time, and certainly trans women were a part of drag since for a very long time, and they would definitely reject the term of female impersonator today. I just want to let you know you'll probably hear it throughout the presentation, and I'll just go back and forth between drag queen and female impersonator. What you see on the screen is a picture of our drag queens there on the steps of the World War Memorial in Indianapolis in 1969. You can probably see the World War Memorial behind me. And they are advertising for what is it called? Oh, they're advertising for upcoming performances at a local lodge and the Madam C.J. Walker Theater. So they even had drag queen performances at Madam Walker Theater. And I will move along. Here's another picture of one of the drag performers, Candy Live the Life I Love Laverne, and she is looking very fabulous. This is another picture from 1969, published in the Indianapolis Recorder. So Indianapolis Recorder is Indianapolis's longest running Black newspaper here in Indy, still going to this day, and it's been digitized, and this digital project really helped me complete my research as I was, in grad school and working full time. Having that digital aspect really helped me to move my research along. So Candy Laverne is advertising a benefit show for the Indianapolis Recorder that happened around Christmas time. And so they had jazz musicians, dancers, and our drag queen performers. Here is a picture of Indiana Avenue in 1942. You can see the buildings all around it are, there's a lot of buildings, there's a lot of urban density. You see cars parked along the street, you see a trolley car, you see people walking around. So it's a very happening place. And people said when you were walking around Indiana Avenue, you could just hear music spilling outside into the streets from the jazz clubs along Indiana Avenue. So I got the idea for this project in my intro to public history class at IUPUI. When one of the professors, we were reading a book on LGBTQ history and how it's covered in museums, and one of my professors talked about gay clubs being along Indiana Avenue. And so, I sat up straight and I was like, okay, I need to look into this to see what is there. And I went to a lot of different archives and special collections around the city of Indianapolis, and a lot of them just told me that they didn't have any information for me. One librarian actually said I had to kind of look at the records from a sideways approach to see what was available. However, I don't think people really consider the Indianapolis Recorder as a historical record of gay life in Indianapolis. And when I started looking at the Indianapolis Recorder, that's when, this gay world inside of a Black world just came to life for me. So my thesis statement turned out to be in the 1930s and 1940s, gay Black men held visible positions in the Black entertainment industry of Indianapolis. So this is that same intersection to this day. You can see that it is completely different. It's not as dense. You don't see as many people walking around. It's a lot of surface level parking lots to accommodate for automobiles from people driving in from the suburbs. So downtown Indianapolis, that Black entertainment district no longer exists in the same way it used to. You can still see Madam Walker Theater in the distance in that picture. It's still there. But Indiana Avenue, as we knew it in the 1930s and 40s, is completely gone. So why study Black drag queens? I really wanted to look at the historical contributions of gay Black men and Black trans women in the city of Indianapolis. I don't think that's ever been really looked at. We do have an emerging LGBTQ scholarship here in Indy. However, that scholarship seems to happen after Stonewall. So we like to think of 1969 Stonewall riots in New York City as our big coming out moment. We were once in the closet before 1969, and then afterwards we all just came out and we were visible. And it turns out that isn't completely the case, especially here in Indianapolis and other Black communities across the United States. During the jazz era, gay Black people and trans women did have some level of visibility within the Black community. Um, so I definitely want to bring that to light and not ignore the contributions of the Black community in helping form and incubate pretty much a queer identity that we recognize today. So methods, like I said, some of the terminology is really out of date. You will see some offensive terms throughout my presentation. And I really look at, the presence of homophobia in the past is also evidence that there was some level of visibility in the past that showed that gay people were there and trans women were there. So you will see some of these terms throughout the presentation as well. Some of my influencing works, I used the work of Dr. Kevin Mumford, who's up at University of Chicago, and his research on interzones, black and white sex districts in Chicago and New York in the early 20th century. And he really talks about in his research how black entertainment districts in Chicago and New York stood as these inner zones where black people and white people kind of participated in vices together in drinking and sex work, um, and all that, and gangs and all that. So in Indianapolis, I applied that theory to Indiana Avenue as our interzone, where black people and white people were intermingling. Of course, black people didn't have a choice of the matter, as you know, white people in Indianapolis didn't really want to get rid of vices. They just didn't want them in their neighborhood. So you see a red light district on the east end of Indianapolis get shut down around 1919 when Prohibition goes into effect. And all those things kind of go underground, but still exist along Indiana Avenue. And I believe, you know, in this place along Indiana Avenue, where you had sex, drugs, and jazz being an expression of of humanity and an expression of human sexuality. I believe this created kind of the perfect storm in order for queer people to have a level of visibility along Indiana Avenue and Black entertainment districts throughout the states. So I didn't find any pictures of the drag queens actually performing on stage. However, I did pull from a researcher, Laura Grantmeyer, who researched female impersonators at Pittsburgh's Hill District from 1920 to 1960. And so that picture that you see on the left on the screen is of Gilda, and she is a female impersonator from Pittsburgh's Hill District with her backup dancer, and she is performing a floor show right there. So to give you a little context about, you know, when these drag queens were really flourishing, I also want to put them into context in Indiana Avenue and kind of like a brief history of Indiana Avenue as a Black entertainment district. In 1870, there were 974 Black residents who lived in Indianapolis, and most would have been concentrated along Indiana Avenue. And in that time period, that land was really considered undesirable to white people. It was very swampy. It was close to White River and Fall Creek, and also the canal, which all had a tendency to flood, and people were throwing their trash in the canal, and it was a lot of mosquitoes. So it was very undesirable. But you see that by the 1940s, the Black community had turned that land into a very viable property and very lucrative businesses to really thrive. By 1919, Prohibition goes into effect, and vice is moved out of white neighborhoods in Indianapolis and concentrated along Indiana Avenue. And by 1933, we have our first reported pansy show. This isn't the first female impersonator show. The first female impersonator show that I found documented in Indianapolis was around 1870. And those were really attached to minstrel shows. So actors dressing up in blackface and as women, just kind of mocking Black women. And it could have been straight men. I have documented cases that some of those female impersonators were straight men. But when you get to 1933 and you have the word pansy attached to a show, there's a very conscious homosexuality attached to the performers in the show. So that is our very first documented Pansy Show along Indiana Avenue was 1933, and in the city of Indianapolis. In 1950, the city begins to buy property along Indiana Avenue as they do see it as they're trying to expand the downtown core, and they see it as land that can be used to benefit downtown businesses. Housing in Indianapolis starts to relax a little bit. So Black people with means start to move out of or away from Indiana Avenue. And then by 1970, housing is reduced by half along Indiana Avenue, and people, local government are talking about putting in a downtown university, which turns into IUPUI, which used to be located in a poor Black neighborhood. And a- and Unigov goes into effect in 1970 as well. And Unigov was consolidating all these surrounding townships around Indianapolis, which really diluted our Black political power at that time, which was approaching 20% in the city. More townships, you're adding more white citizens to Indianapolis proper, which diluted our Black political power down to from 20% down to 7%. It is currently in 2020, we have 30% Black population here in Indianapolis. So you start seeing that Black political power starting to build now. We're starting to have conversations about getting a Black mayor and making sure that the needs of the Black community are met today. But going back to our time period of 1930s, this was Indiana Avenue during the jazz era. You can see it was very densely populated, very urban. A lot of businesses were there, a lot of jazz clubs, cafes, restaurants, hotels, barbershops. There are churches nearby, all kinds of stuff. Oh, sorry, I don't know why it's moving on its own now. So where you see the red arrow is Raymond D's Paradise Garden at 427 Indiana Avenue. That's where the first Pansy Ball took place in Indianapolis, right there. And it was reported that 2,000 people were inside the club in 1933 at the first Pansy show, and 1,000 people were waiting outside to get in. Um, and so here was the headline, which was published in the Indianapolis Recorder August 5th, 1933. Look out, New York, Indianapolis now has its own copyright fairy show. And I'll read the first paragraph there for you. For the first time in the 112 years since a group of pioneers settled here in Indianapolis, has caught up with New York, Chicago, Washington, Atlantic City, and Paris. Believe it or not, Indianapolis has had its first fairy, fag, pansy, sissy, public stage show, and dance. So they put all of the expletives like right there, just so you knew what it was. And I'll read from my paper a little bit for you. The performers of the first Pansy show dressed as female impersonators and sang the great jazz hits of the day, such as Stormy Weather, performed by Francis Davis or Harold Blakey, and Honey, Won't You Please Come Home, performed by the chorus of 15 female impersonators. The Pansy show received a positive review in the Indianapolis Recorder, which was quite critical of the protesters of the first Pansy show. The article opens, quote, a jaded city conscience, long since lulled into a state of coma through tolerance of baseball pool lotteries, back alley crap games, strip poker parties, illicit love tangles, and promiscuous running around by both husbands and wives, literally opened its eyes wide in amazement, then sat up straight in surprise, and finally emitted howls of hypocritical condemnation, at the same time affecting the pose of closing its nostrils between the thumb and forefinger, unquote. The paper charged these protesters for their hypocrisy of tolerance of illegal activities and infidelity, but directed their fury at the first ever Pansy show. To follow was pushback from the law abiding members of the Black community. The Pansy performers were certainly members of the local Black community where they went to the same grocery stores, barbershops, saloons, and churches that lined Indiana Avenue and surrounding neighborhoods. In 1933, an anonymous letter to the editor titled For Decency's Sake makes two truths clear among the homophobic people of Indianapolis and everyone else, that gay people have always had some level of visibility in Indianapolis society, and that their very existence holds back Black progress. Quote, this type of character has always existed, but it should be made to remain in the background and not be allowed to raise its ugly head and mingle in society. As a matter of fact, every pansy in town should be loaded on a discarded battleship, towed to sea, and blown up, unquote. The letter continues, There are outcasts of every race of people, but I'm almost certain that we have a surplus, which is extremely detrimental to the progress of the right thinking, law abiding, unquote. The letter writer was aware of the vice that thronged the Black community and invoked the power of authorities that turned a blind eye to the vice that persisted along Indiana Avenue. The visible gay Black men were conflated with gangs, prostitution, gambling, and drinking. So, just to give you an idea again of what it would look like inside Paradise Gardens in 1933, um, you have, I refer to the work of Laura Grantmeyer again. You have Gilda, who is one of the drag queens from Pittsburgh Hill District. And on the left, you see her performing on a stage with an entire jazz ensemble backing her up. This picture would have been taken between 1946 and 1953. So you see that she is supported by Black musicians. On the right, you see Gilda performing a floor show at one of the saloons in the Pittsburgh Hill district. And what I think is really interesting about this picture is the audience. You do see white people in the audience. And as this operated as an interzone for Pittsburgh Hill district, and you may have very well have seen white people at the very first Pansy show in on Indiana Avenue. Now, I will say that there weren't any documented gay clubs along Indiana Avenue until the 1960s, where you see the a club called the Pink Poodle, which hosted drag shows. And I talked to the son of the owner of the Pink Poodle, and he said he didn't remember it being a gay club, but a lot of elders in the gay community here in Indianapolis remember it. Seeing a lot of gay people there. Now, the son of the Pink Poodle did say that um, he said that his father welcomed anyone that came in there. Then the Pink Poodle transitioned into becoming the Famous Door, which was a gay club along Indiana Avenue. Now I'm going to talk about the backlash that was to follow. Quote, Chief Michael F. Morrissey of the Indianapolis Police Department and his efficient staff officers are to be highly commended for their action Saturday night in frustrating what would have been a veritable theatrical exhibit of the entire local colony of degenerates. A bold attempt by promoters of the scheme to pollute the social atmosphere of the community with a new type of stingy indecency, unquote. The letter of praise to Chief Morrissey's reaction to the pansy balls does not mention that Morrissey was willing to overlook the vice occurring along Indiana Avenue, but he did not allow the new type of stench and decency to fester in an open environment. Quote, informed of the plans of the leaders of the pansy ball crowd to spit in the face of common decency by turning their nasty experiment into an annual affair, unquote. A statement that suggests the promoters of the pansy ball were aware of their popularity since the Pansy Balls were planned annually. The pushback from some Black community members prompted clever promoters to refer to Pansy Balls as female impersonator shows in the future. Because remember, people in Indianapolis were already familiar with the term of just a female impersonator ball, and that kind of takes the sexual connotation out of it too. Quote, with Chief Morrissey's disapproval registered against all such programs for Indianapolis, backed by an outraged public, pansy dancers will have to look elsewhere for a field in which to entertain, unquote. Yet Indiana Avenue operated as the interzone for Indianapolis, which severely limited where gay Black men could entertain in Indianapolis. In 1934, the pansy performers had more run-ins with Chief Morrissey. Quote, Sally Rand has lost her fan. Give it back, you nasty man. The Sally Rand was the pansies who gave a female impersonation at the Grand Terrace last Friday night and were raided by the police. The nasty mans were the coppers who stopped the show. They were good enough not to arrest the boys, and there are quotations around boys in this column. They complain loud and long that they are decent and should be let alone. Chief Morrissey has other ideas. This is about the fourth run-in the lads have had with the boys in blue, who are determined that they shall not show. More power to them, I mean the police, unquote. The open resistance from the pansy performers against Chief Morrissey and his officers prevented their arrests. Morrissey's mission to put an end to pansy shows on the avenue meant that he saw pansy performers as an unacceptable form of entertainment. While the pansy craze was met with little resistance in other major cities like Chicago, New Orleans, and New York, in Indianapolis there was open resistance from some members of the Black community. With the threat of the police chief to intervene, the pansy shows were not allowed to continue with the explicit homosexuality attached. The pansy performers resisted loss of employment in the Black entertainment industry through open protests of Chief Morrissey's police raids and cleverly transformed their act to drop reference to sexual orientation out of their show promotions and continue their craft as female impersonators. So yeah, I think they were very smart in doing that and just keeping their craft going. And we're still able to have employment, and we're actively resisting arrest from the police chief. They had some level of support from the community. And I will get into that. And I just think the Indianapolis Recorder is just such a fabulous document of Black life here in Indianapolis. And, I think the first Pansy Ball really had the Recorder open these community conversations around, the pansies, like with this poll that they published October 20th, 1934. What is your opinion of pansies or fags? And I'll read some of those opinions. So S.W. Whitley of 2259 North Capitol Avenue, who was an insurance executive, said, "If I were mayor or governor, I would have every single one of them thrown in the can. I think they are the nastiest people alive. There was a time when this sort of person was very modest and respectful, but now they are extremely too bold for any good." So one thing that I think is interesting about Whitley's comment is that he says there was a time. So it seems like there has always been a time where gay people were just kind of always visible. They just, I guess, were more modest about it, or more not so out there and bold with it. Now, the Reverend J.C. Crocker of 1428 Martindale Avenue, who was a fancy penmanship writer. I don't know how you get that job, but I definitely want it. He said, "I believe that some folk are born that way and others acquire the habit. They amuse me, so I have to stand and watch them whenever I see them." So I don't really see that one as really negative. Like, he is there, you can see there's that conversation of, is it nature versus nurture? Are gay people born that way, or do they acquire the habit? So, it's kind of like, who cares? They're fun to watch when they're around. Um, so there were other letters of support, such as the letter submitted by Mrs. Holloway, printed in the Recorder following the backlash. Mrs. Holloway's letter, printed September 9th, 1933, reads, "Editor, having read in your worthy weekly an article deriding and censoring the recent female impersonators review," and Mrs. Holloway only puts quotations around impersonators here, and not female impersonators. I, along with others, became interested in knowing what the reason was for such an attack. It seems to me that a little too much stress has been put on some forms of amusements, while others, far more detrimental, are allowed to be tolerated. Mrs. Holloway was referring to the stag parties held at the casino where men only were admitted, quote, for the sole purpose of satisfying a lust and passion of the lowest degree. The show, gladly given by a number of au fait women, and that's slang for white, was a source of pleasure for our gentlemen, some of whom, mind you, were indignant at the suggestion of an effort by our unfortunate members of the intermediate sex to entertain in a perfectly proper and legitimate manner. So I really love that letter. It's definitely an open letter of support. I love that the Recorder's editors even published that letter of support for the pansy balls that were happening in 1933. And that she even put quotations just around impersonators, not female impersonators, which leads me to believe that she had very progressive ideas about gender, and suggesting that some of these performers were trans women. Also talking about the intermediate sex in that letter as well. So she was just very progressive, and it really shows that there were very progressive attitudes around gender and sexuality in the Black community in the 1930s in Indianapolis. And it wasn't just in Indianapolis, but the Indianapolis Recorder has examples of what Black queerness looked like nationally and even internationally. In the picture that you see on the left, these are three female impersonators at the Republic Club, which was a nightclub in Washington, D.C. This was published in the Recorder April 30th, 1938. And the article that's attached to this picture is quite fascinating because it's talking about the history of homosexuality in 1938 in Indianapolis in a Black newspaper. It's really awesome. And it's a very objective view of homosexuality as well. So they're really kind of going through what it looked like in ancient times like Greece and Roman times, all the way up to the present of 1930s. And they even had an anthropologist in the article talking about human sexuality and human variation within sexuality. And you don't really see that kind of reporting in the white newspapers like the Indianapolis Star, for example, always talks about it being kind of deviant behavior to be gay or any of the such. And that middle picture, this one was printed in 1935 of female impersonator Mae West from Kansas City, Missouri, who also performed on Indiana Avenue and another venue on the east side of downtown Indianapolis. So this was published in 1935 of Mae West. And we talk about how jazz musicians would go on tour and they would access the Chitlin Circuit, which was a network of Black entertainment districts throughout the states that would give them a way to perform on the national level. Well, I believe that female impersonators were accessing the same Chitlin Circuit to go on tour, like you see with Mae West from Kansas City, Missouri, who came to show us her talents in 1935. And then the picture on the right is Carol, a female impersonator singer, before her reported reassignment surgery that took place in Copenhagen. And this photo is from the Indianapolis Recorder, published February 25th, 1967. The article's title, Would Rather Switch. And Carol is quoted as saying in the paper, Black women in America are among the luckiest on the face of the earth, and it would be marvelous to be one. Gay Black men and Black transgender women were visible on the stages of Indiana Avenue and on its city sidewalks. Pansies lived in the apartments lining the avenue as early as 1935. In the 1940s, gay Black men and Black transgender women were openly walking the avenue. Column writer St. Clair Gibson wrote an open letter to Recorder staff writer Opal Tandy, who was in Europe fighting in World War II. February 7th, Gibson published an update to Tandy of the goings on back home. In the middle of the letter, Gibson writes, quote, several new he-she's are now strutting the avenue with their hair marceled down to the bricks. We even saw one wearing earrings. Some of the less timid males are trying to put them on the make. It's the same old thing, pal. There are all kinds of freaks, and we guess they will be with us always, unquote. But a reader responded to Gibson's column letter with a letter of support for gay Black men and Black transgender women. Quote, I read your letter to the soldiers overseas, which I thought was very nice to send them the hometown news. But one thing you didn't mention to him was what the Negroes are doing in Indianapolis to help win the war. You dished him all the other dirt but that. Mr. Gibson, you made a statement concerning the freaks, which was out of bounds. That is my opinion. The Indianapolis News, Indianapolis Star, and Indianapolis Times, which are the white newspapers, wouldn't have dared to print in their papers about their people, which you put in the Recorder about freaks of our race. Suppose everybody in this big world was just like you. Tell me what kind of a place would this be to live in? So that is why God made different kinds of vegetables and fruits. For those who dislike one will have the choice of the other. Every real he-man with pants on is not a man. Every woman in a dress on is not a real woman. Indianapolis will always be made up of be a southern town because it is made up of southern Negroes and whites who do not know the Civil War is over. And as long as you are around, there will always be different kinds of people. Signed, a citizen of Indianapolis, unquote. Gibson admitted that the reader fan had a point in the letter and confessed, quote, We didn't mean any offense to those persons who practice or approve of this sort of thing. We as human beings know that this sort of thing will be going on long after this old, bedraggled body is a molding in the cold, cold grounds. Unquote. The reader's letter invokes God, who makes different types of fruit and vegetables, as he does people to appeal to a religious audience. The most progressive paragraph was the last, where the reader wrote about transgender people existing and how exhausting it was to deal with conservative people by labeling Indianapolis citizens Southern people. Gibson struggles with the last paragraph of the reader's letter, but acknowledges, quote, regardless how you feel about the writer, you must admit that he has a right to his say. Um, in Indianapolis, white people who ventured on the avenue would have experienced local impersonator talent that received national acclaim. In 1936, Doris Duchess White, who you see her name on the advertisement, made headlines as a national female impersonator icon. White's act lasted a long 16 weeks in Columbus, Ohio, and next she took on Chicago, Illinois, where she worked in the same venues as famed pansy entertainer Frankie Half Pint Jackson. Jackson was reported to stand at 5'2" and was a powerhouse entertainer. He pleased Indianapolis audiences in 1933. Jackson was known for throwing his voice into a falsetto and singing the female parts in duets. Occasionally, he sang both the man's and woman's parts and changed the lyrics of famous jazz songs. Jackson's version of My Daddy Rocks Me has many overt sexual tones that culminates in the end with Jackson imitating what is considered the first orgasm on a recorded song while he described a sexual relationship with a man referred to as daddy. In 1937, the recorder reported on the star power of Doris Duchess White as she traveled the Chitlin Circuit to Cincinnati, Ohio, with a review of other Black entertainers. After the 14-week show at the Rosebud Inn in Cincinnati, Doris reportedly said, "It's time to go now, girls." In 1944, she worked 2 shows nightly at the Log Cabin Supper Club alongside newcomer female impersonator Ivy Anderson and other entertainers. By the 1950s, the Duchess worked regularly in the bars and clubs along Indiana Avenue. Doris was rarely referred to as a female impersonator. Her level of acceptance in the Black community along Indiana Avenue and her talented status may have created a status of Black woman entertainer that was rarely given to female impersonators. The advertisement seen on the screen featuring the Duchess and Ivy Anderson is very ambiguous as to whether the picture of the woman is a female impersonator or not. The advertisement plays into the awe and mystery of the craft of female impersonation that would attract patrons to attend the show. They had to find out for themselves. And I like to think that, Doris Duchess coming up in the 1930s, and you have a newcomer like Ivy Anderson come on the scene in the 1940s, that, Doris probably stood in as a mentor to Ivy to kind of pass along her knowledge of the field. So yeah, there's a picture of Doris again in an advertisement in the Indianapolis Recorder, and she's right there on the left. Um, and she's with other performers at the Defense Workers Social Club located at 318 and a half Indiana Avenue, published in the Indianapolis Recorder, April 29th, 1944. I would definitely love to see this research expanded to include Black lesbian women and their influence on Indiana Avenue. I definitely came across articles about male impersonators that happened along Indiana Avenue. But yeah, in conclusion, I would like to say gay Black men and Black trans women were integral members of the Black Entertainment District of Indianapolis. If you wanted your jazz club to be popping, you had drag queens there. Gay Black men and Black trans women were contributed to the identity of Black Indianapolis. But I would also flip that and say, the Black community of Indianapolis was really incubating and supporting these drag performers and gay people who lived visible and trans women who lived visible lives along Indiana Avenue in the 1930s. And there's documentation of these drag performers working along Indiana Avenue from the 1930s, all the way up to what is considered the death of Indiana Avenue in 1970. After things started getting closed and bulldozed along Indiana Avenue, that's when you start seeing articles in the Recorder talking about crime that female impersonators are committing. And I believe that may have been because they had trouble accessing gay clubs for employment. And so they had to resort to other means of getting their money that could include stealing. So yeah, I want to thank you all for coming and listening to my presentation. And if you have any questions, I would love to take them at this time. That is a picture of me in drag there too. Let's see. I
Thank
see
you, Stephen. That was amazing.
you.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's just as good the second, third time around. There's more that you
Thank
learn, which makes it all the better, which is great.
Yes, yes, yes. I don't know why this thing is moving. Let me stop sharing my screen there. I really liked how the Indie Star did a story on my research, but they also interviewed Black drag queen performers to this day, and just hearing about what this research meant to them really just pulled at my heartstrings for sure. It was just great hearing how it really puts them into a historical context and showing that they really built the drag industry here in Indianapolis.
Yeah,
And it also like really hurts my heart to hear that they are dealing with racism in an industry that they helped build.
right. With that in mind, I keep thinking about this term geography of resistance, and we both living in Indianapolis know what it's like to be here, but
Mhm.
this was such a radical kind of bubble of an experience taking place.
Yes, yes, because you always hear about how conservative Indianapolis is and always was, but you see different kind of politics at play within along Indiana Avenue and within the Black community. Certainly, you see levels of respectability politics, which is why so many people didn't want pansy performers to have that visible presence. But you also see that kind of resistance, like, hey, there's all kinds of different people, even within the Black community, that deserve to be celebrated.
Hmm. From the interviews and statements that you found through your research, do you know if many of the performers would have considered themselves um, acting in some kind of resistance or simply just existing, because it was fun? It was a way to express themselves.
I think that that's still research that needs to be done. I have no I don't know if it was. I would assume that they were having a good time. From what I heard, I talked to David Leander Williams, who wrote Indianapolis Jazz. So he really concentrated his research along Indiana Avenue, and he talks about. He gave me a few anecdotes that he's heard interviewing some people for his book about some of the drag performers. One that would perform with a live boa constrictor and actually put it on people in the bars, but
Mhm.
also that trans women would be in the bar sitting down and men from out of town would approach them and everybody in the bar knew that this was a trans person. And so they would just kind of like, I guess, giggle while this man was buying this trans woman drinks and stuff. I heard, a lot of anecdotes like that. I do think it was probably fun for them, and they did, resist, especially in the 1930s when the police were trying to shut pansy balls down, while all these other kinds of vices and forms of illegal entertainment are allowed to kind of persist along Indiana Avenue. Um, the gay people and trans people were always kind of resisting this buy-in, I believe, to respectability politics and whiteness in a way. And that was one act of resistance where they were successful at resisting their own arrests.
Hmm. I'm also really curious about, you know, like, what is it, global sexuality. So you spoke a lot about what you just kind of said, you know, the vices that were taking place, sex work as legal trade, or sex work as trade rather, maybe not legal, but it was trade and accepted trade at the time. But
Yes.
because the environment was so contentious, do you have any evidence of individuals migrating from here to other spaces internationally that might have been more conducive to their survival?
Yes, there was definitely the example of Carol who went to Copenhagen, and I guess she stayed there because she felt like it was more open and inclusive, where she could live openly as a woman. And Doris Duchess White, she spent a few years up in Chicago working, and I'm sure she was able to really build a name for herself up there. So yeah, people were moving around, and I wouldn't say they were escaping Indianapolis because Doris ended up coming back to Indianapolis in the 40s to continue her craft. There's always something about Indianapolis that draws people back in a way.
The boomerang city.
Hometown. Yeah, so it's where her family is, and it seems like she was able to be successful here, just as successful as she was in Chicago.
Hmm. Okay. We've got a couple of questions from some members. One says, do you have any thoughts on the significance of the reverend supporter of the pansy craze? It goes on to say, I wouldn't have thought that a minister would have been a public supporter of
Yeah.
pansy balls. Do you think this was someone writing under a pseudonym or nickname, or just part of this more surprisingly tolerant urban structure subculture of Indianapolis?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that you don't really see evidence of homophobia at that time attached to religious institutions. In my research, like I don't see, any kind of like pastor coming out and saying this is wrong. You just see individuals who are thinking that we won't get our civil rights. It was more attached to homophobia at that time, was more attached to civil rights than it was in terms of religious, I guess freedom is what they're calling it now. um, and so they were saying, with the presence of gay people in society, we will never get our civil rights. So, which I think is just playing into respectability politics, which is that politic that tells you to tells Black people to pull their pants up, change their hairstyle. But once you do all those things, then that goalpost always moves to something else to always keep us from having our civil rights in society. Once you play that game, so the Reverend really. He probably was a minister. I mean, he gave his real address too. You can look him up in ancestry records and see that he was really living there, and it just didn't bother him. It just wasn't a thing. I think that's something to look into, is when that kind of change to seeing homophobia permeate in churches is something worth studying for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the researcher's name of the Pittsburgh Hill District, her name is Laura Grantmeyer. Yeah, and those pictures, and what's awesome is that those pictures of those female impersonators made it into an archive, because I've asked like every collecting institution in the city, and no one had anything prior to 1960s of female impersonators on stages. Um, and so I'm just really thankful that the recorder documented that aspect of Black life as well.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
We got another question. You've kind of alluded to it, but just to maybe expound upon it, if the performers were from the Indianapolis area or on tour visiting, or just kind of migrated from elsewhere?
Oh yeah, so these performers I talked about, like Doris Duchess White, Ivy Anderson, they are from Indianapolis. It's really hard to find, and at the first Pansy Ball, they are from Indianapolis as well. And in that first Pansy Ball, they actually did use their real names, but it seems like after that and all the backlash, people just started going using their stage names on the stage. But those first drag queens, yes, they were definitely from Indianapolis. And then you had performers like Mae West, who came from Kansas City, Missouri. So they even had their own set of drag queens that performed. And it seems like if you really wanted your jazz club to really shine, you would have drag queens perform. So even Madam Walker Theater had drag queens, the Cotton Club, um, definitely Raymond D's Paradise Garden. I did see some evidence of some club owners wouldn't host drag queens in their club. It seemed like very few. And then there was a restaurant owner that wouldn't serve drag queens in her restaurant
Mm.
along Indiana Avenue. But yeah, they were definitely there. They were living along Indiana Avenue, around Indiana Avenue, and had a very visible presence there.
What would you like for your research to do?
I think the Indianapolis Star really, when they published the story on my research, the way that they interviewed Black drag queens was very, it meant a lot because they really showed the parallels and really placed these Black drag, my research into a history that flows into 2020. So I just wanted to really challenge this idea that the Black community was hyper homophobic. I don't think that's true at all. Sure, homophobia exists in the states, just like in any community, but I don't wouldn't say that the Black community is more homophobic than any other community in the states. And the evidence really shows that the Black community was very supportive of these pansy balls, of gay people existing in an open way. I even saw like anecdotes of, one of the um, a Black woman in Hallville neighborhood loaned her dress out to one of the pansy performers, and she actually wrote into the recorder because she wanted her dress back. So they were talking about that in the recorder. So you really see that there is a lot of support from the Black community here in Indianapolis. So I really wanted to challenge that idea of hyper homophobia in the Black community. I really wanted to show how Black drag queens really built the industry, and the way we recognize drag today is something that was really started in that jazz era, that we recognize as drag shows today.
Mm. Well, thank you so much, Stephen. This has just been delightful to learn more about. I appreciate the work that you've done and that you're continuing this as like a living research project, and adding more onto it as you
Yeah.
experience more about it. So I appreciate that very much. I want to let the guests know that I'm dropping the link to the survey in the chat. I'll leave that there for a couple of minutes. If you have a second to click on that, it'll be very fast. But we would appreciate your feedback as we continue to grow our programming. And if you have any further questions for Stephen, can you put your slide back up so we can
Oh,
see your contact information?
I can share it for you.
So
There
if
it
you have
is.
questions for Stephen, feel free to
My
send
work
them to me.
email, and I love Twitter. So if you're on Twitter,
And with that, just thank you so very much for sharing today. And
thank you,
I'll
Denise. I appreciate it.
leave the link up and play us out.
Thank you.